you're a mermaid, merman, a starfish, I don't know. This is probably up your alley. What's up guys, it's Alex. This is part 3 of my physical TBR video. These are the books I want to read this year, and I want to hold myself accountable. And you guys are witnessing this. These are the books I should finish by the end of the year. Hopefully. Life gets busy, so you never know. But in this video, this is the poetry books that I've collected over the past few months that I want to read. If you're interested in more nonfiction or fiction books, make sure to check out parts 2 and parts 1. Part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is fiction and part 2 is nonfiction. And today, let's get into our poetry books. I'm an ocean baby. And the first book on my TBR, which I hope to be reading soon when I go to the beach. I'm hoping I get to go to the beach soon. I live in Texas, so I live in the middle of Texas, I should say. I'm landlocked. So when I do go to the beach, it's an event, okay? This is Poems of the Sea. It's an anthology that is edited by Gaby Morgan. And I bought this because I love the sea and I love poetry, and I actually myself have been writing a lot of poems about the sea and the ocean in particular, and so this just immediately caught my attention. And it also has the same design, or similar design I should say, to my Treasure Island book back here. I don't know if it's focusing or not, but I have a Treasure Island book that has a similar design to it. I like the texture of it. And the book itself is quite small. Here's a book from my nonfiction video. You can see the size of it. So this is a book that you can easily fit into your purse, into a beach bag. The other day I was going through and just trying to see if there was a short poem to read, and I found one. Ah, here it is. Okay. This poem really it got to me. It's called Sea Change by Genevieve Taggart, 1894 to 1948. It says, "You are no more, but sunken in a sea, sheer into dream. 10,000 leagues you fell. And now you lie green golden, while a bell swings with the tide, my heart. And all is well till I look down, and wavering, the spell, your loveliness, returns. There in the sea, where you lie amber pale and coral cool, you are most loved, most lost, most beautiful." It is quite thick for being such a little book. It's about 220 pages or so. 226 pages of poetry relating to the sea. So if you're like me and you're a sea baby or an ocean baby, if you're a mermaid, merman, a starfish, I don't know, this is probably up your alley if you like reading poetry. And it seems to be poetry from all sorts of years here. I'm seeing a lot of 1800s, so let me see if there's some. I'm seeing a lot of poems from 1800s actually. 1800s and 1900s, so it's a mix of things. The next one on my poetry list is this beautiful book called Indeterminate Inflorescence. Big words. This is translated by Anton Her. It's Lectures on Poetry by Seong-bok. And I've started reading a little bit of it, but I need to get back into it. I started reading it on a car trip. The way it's written, so that you can see, it's little snippets of little lectures, if you will, on poetry and writing in general. And the first one says this: "Inflorescence is the order in which flowers bloom on a stem. An alternative word for inflorescence in pure Korean is flower sequence. There are 2 kinds of inflorescence. Determinate inflorescence means flowers bloom from top to bottom with limited growth. Indeterminate inflorescence means the flowers bloom from bottom to top and growth is unlimited. We might say poems bloom in indeterminate inflorescence as they grow from concrete to abstract, from secular to sacred. Poetry takes its form in its endless failure to express what language cannot." And once I read that, I was hooked on the rest of this book. I've only gotten a few pages in. And it's really beautiful. I love how it's just chunks of, it's like little mini lectures. And so if you're somebody who wants to get more into poetry, or if you're, you know, a seasoned writer and just want some inspiration, if you want to just lay back with a good book, this is probably the one for you. I'll let you know my final thoughts on it. This came from a company called Sublinary Editions, and they have a lot of really cool topics, like a lot of cool books about a lot of cool things. So this is not necessarily like poetry, anthology type poetry. This is more book about poetry. Speaking about another book about poetry is Poet Warrior by Jo Harjo. She is the Poet Laureate of the United States, or I think she was, like last year or the year before. This is a memoir. And I was reading a lot about this, and so I do want to read the back here. It says, revered for speaking truth to power with lyricism and compassion, Joy Harjo invites us to travel along the heartaches, losses, and humble realizations of her Poet Warrior road in this musical kaleidoscopic memoir. Moving fluidly between prose, song, and poetry, Poet Warrior reveals how Harjo, the first Native American to serve as U.S. Poet Laureate, came to write poetry that calls for love and justice. And so it says, three-term Poet Laureate Jo Harjo offers a triumphant contemplation of her trailblazing life. She was Poet Laureate in 2019. I think I saw on Twitter, kind of like this one, I saw people talking about this on Twitter originally. I saw people talking about this on Twitter as well, and so I was like, I'm going to add this to my list. And it's a memoir about a poet laureate, and so I want to see her reflections on her process becoming a poet and becoming, you know, writing about the stuff that she writes about. And so I'm excited to hear about that, and then also read her poetry in the future. I think that'll be a fun little thing for me to do, is to see, okay, what is her memoir, and then read her poetry after. The next book is another book that is about poetry. Don't worry, we'll be getting into books that are filled with poetry in a second. But this is The Poetry of Strangers, What I Learned Traveling America with a Typewriter by Brian Sonia-Wallace. And I'm just going to read a snippet of this since my battery is like running out and flashing at me. It says, before he became an award-winning writer and poet, Brian set up a typewriter on the street with a sign that said Poetry Store and discovered something surprising. All over America, people want poems. An amateur busker at first, Brian asked countless strangers, what do you need a poem about? To his surprise, passerby opened up to share their deepest yearnings, loves, and heartbreaks. Hundreds of them, then thousands around the nation. Brian's poetry crusade drew countless converts from all walks of life. In this book, he tells the story of his cross-country journey in a series of heartfelt and insightful essays. In a time of unprecedented loneliness and isolation, Brian's journey shows how art can be a vital bridge to community in surprising places. And I believe this was published in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so this was actually published in 2020, you know, at the very beginning of the pandemic. And so that's where that sentence about how his journey shows how art can be a vital bridge to community in surprising places in a time of loneliness and isolation. That's kind of what sold me about this book when I originally bought it. And so what interests me is the idea that everybody in America wants a poem, or, you know, it says what, all over America people want poems. Because I remember in school, like, poetry being something that a lot of kids dreaded. Like, even I dreaded learning about, like, classic poems because I just didn't understand them in Old English sometimes. But I always had fun, like, writing them or reading modern poetry. And I think, you know, there's so many different types of poetry for all sorts of different people. And I think once people realize that, that's when they start opening up poetry. I mean, everybody listens to songs, and in a way, lyrics are poems. So I can see how that goes along. I am interested and intrigued to see, like, what kinds of people he encounters. Like, who were the ones that were, like, walking up to him and saying, I need a poem? Like, what did they want a poem about? And then what did he learn? Are there different, like, styles of poetry for the different regions of the U.S.? Like, does somebody from Texas like romance poems, while somebody from California prefers, like, poems about nature? Like, what are the little idiosyncrasies between the regions of the states? I'm curious to hear his thoughts, and of course this is in essay form. So that is this book. Now on to the poetry collections. Wait, I lied. One more book. There's one more book that's not a poetry collection, but for right now, here's a poetry collection. It's called The Death of Sitting Bear. This is by N. Scott Momaday, who is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Housemaid of Dawn. And these are some of his new and selected poems. And on the back, what do we have? A quote by Joe Harjo right there. And it says, "These are the poems of a master poet born of an age when our ears were not so bent towards digital production. Or should I say, these are the poems of a bear who has walked through several generations and stands before us, breathing clouds into cold dawn, bearing this book of poetry. The bear's journey is mythic, a migration through tragedy and beauty over lands rich with horses and stories. When you read these poems, you will learn to hear deeply the sound a soul makes as it sings about the mystery of dreaming and becoming." And I mean, that's just absolutely gorgeous quote by Joe there, by Joy. Have I been saying Joe? By Joy Harjo. Oh my god. I hope I've been saying her name right. And so this is, let's see, he was born in the Kiowa tribe in Oklahoma, and he grew up in Indian reservations throughout the Southwest. The Death of Sitting Bear showcases, as never before, his extraordinary lyrical talent in the matters closest to his heart. And so I think I spoke about this previously in my nonfiction video, but I do love learning about other cultures, ancient and modern. And I've always loved learning about First Nations. And specifically, like, I learned about the Navajo or Diné in elementary school, and I remember just loving just the way of life and learning about them and their history. I love when I can get a good poetry book, a poetry collection about a different culture, and that's exactly what this is, and so I'm excited to dive into that. Next is the Book of Forms. It is just a handbook of poetics, including odd and inventive forms, a companion volume to the Book of Literary Terms. This is by Lewis Putnam Turco. This is the revised and expanded edition. So I think there's one more edition before it, and then this one just includes the odd and inventive forms, which is why I bought this one, because I love learning about weird structures for poems. Normally, actually, until quite recently, the way I write poems is very free verse. And then I learned about a sestina poem and a pantoum poem, and I wrote my first pantoum and my first sestina, and my mind was like, what? It exploded. I was like, wow, it's amazing. Because I always thought like structure would kind of stifle my creativity in writing a poem, but it actually did the opposite, where it allowed me to just make a more mature poem and more mature sounding poem, and more profound, more like I had more profound thoughts in my writing. And you could tell just from like comparing those poems to poems I wrote in college that were mostly free verse. And so I got this book to inspire me and to learn about other forms I can use. I'm definitely not going to read this in like one sitting. I think this is going to be like it's very like textbooky, so I'll kind of look at it time and again when I'm writing. We have the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Like, what a cover. What a cover. Now, I have started reading a little bit into this. Before this, I had never really read Emily Dickinson poems unless it was for like a school project. I don't actually recall reading a poem of hers, but I know that she is supposedly fantastic. There's been TV series, movies about her, and so I really want to dive into her poetry. And I've already started reading some. I understand some I don't, but that's the thing about Old English, is I either understand it or I don't. But that's why I want to sit with this one a little bit longer and really dive into each poem, because I know I struggle with that a little bit. But I love a good challenge, and so that's what this book is. And the last book of my poetry TBR for the moment is Poems from the Edge of Extinction. This is edited by McCabe. It's an anthology of poetry in endangered languages. So kind of going on that theme of languages and cultures. I really just love the concept of this anthology. I haven't even peered, okay, I'm peering inside of it now, but it just, the idea of taking these languages that are endangered and then translating them and putting them all into a book just is amazing. It tells you what language you are, what language you are reading or what they're translating in. It goes through all sorts of different countries here, or continents, I should say. So there's some poems from Europe, poems from Asia, the Americas, and Africa. Let's see, on the back it says each poem appears in its original form alongside an English translation and is accompanied by a commentary about the language, the poet, and the poem in a vibrant celebration of life, diversity, language, and the enduring power of poetry. So if you're someone who also loves learning about languages and cultures and wants to see the way a poem is translated, or just wants to learn about endangered cultures and languages and how we can preserve them and what their cultures are like through the poet's eyes, this is probably a book for you, and we can talk about it too, because I'll be reading this one for sure. And it is pretty thick. It's about 300 pages, give or take. So there's a lot of material in here to cover. And that is the last book of my poetry TBR list. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found, I hope this video kind of illuminated some new books for you to go out and read, whether at the library or for you to go out and buy. And if you haven't already checked out, please do check out my fiction TBR, my nonfiction TBR. There might be other books there that you want to read. Also, let me know what poetry collections you're reading, what poetry styles you guys like. I'm always interested in finding new poetry collections. I really love, again, poetry about the environment, nature, culture, the ocean, of course. And I also love poetry that is surrealist in nature. I've been getting into a lot of surrealism poetry, and so that's one of the next collections I have on my wish list to buy is the Surrealist Poetry Anthology. So let me know what you guys are reading, what you guys want to see me read in the future, if you've actually read any of these poetry, either collections or books, and give me your thoughts on them. I'd love to hear what you think. Till next time, thank you so much. Goodbye.